hermeneutics. So you asked about. So let's just do a question on hermeneutics. So you asked about, is any scripture for me? And I just want to know, like, I think you would probably agree. You've studied books on hermeneutics, right? You have some kind of biblical principles that you go by, and I'm sure you're probably going to use scripture, and you're also going to use like lingo and all that, and how scripture interprets things. But what books have you read on hermeneutics that show that we should be reading ourselves into the text?
Well, it's not about reading books. It's about reading the context of a scripture. So no, I haven't written a book on hermeneutics 101, but depending on the context of any scripture, and again, because we disagree on this topic, I understand where you're coming from and you understand where I'm coming from. But when, Jesus uses, or anyone uses the word you have to look at the context. Context is king, as we always say.
Okay, so do you see yourself in the first century with the number of people when Jesus is speaking to the Jews, unbelieving Jews, before the the new covenant was began or initiated? Do you see yourself in that group as an old covenant believer while you're listening to these prophecies?
Not as an old covenant believer,
Well,
but
go ahead.
That's all right. But when Jesus, for example, the blessings or the beatitudes, right? That an example I gave, Matthew 5. So when he says, "Blessed are you," I do take that as Jesus talking to me today, 2,000 years later.
So if a heretic, according to you at least, would read that verse, can they apply that to themselves?
Sure. I mean, anyone can apply the verse to themselves.
Why would you allow them? Why would you allow them to apply it to themselves?
Why would I allow
a person who is an unbeliever or a heretic? Blessed are you. Go ahead.
Well, because they think they're Christians, followers of Christ, and most of us, when we hear Jesus teaching and commanding things, self-professing Christians.
So if you read, Jesus healing, you have charismatic and Pentecostals, they'll say, oh, look at this verse, let's say Mark chapter 2, where Jesus heals a paralytic man. Can a person who is paralyzed go ahead and apply that self to themselves and say, well, Jesus told me to get up and walk, and then it doesn't happen? How would how would that person experience Jesus not actually doing what he said because he's applying that verse to himself?
Well, I don't know what books you're reading on hermeneutics, but I don't.
It's a hermeneutical question. You have to answer that based on historical context. If I apply that verse to a paralyzed man, see, it's already a problem for you because you're reading yourself into the text, and now it sounds ridiculous. Now it sounds totally ridiculous. Someone's reading themselves into the text, and now it's not good no more because the person is not getting the words of Jesus getting up, and they're not being healed. Jesus is a liar now, according to that standard, if we start using scripture like that and applying everything to ourselves. Don't you agree?
Well, it's taken it out of context.
It's taken it out of historical context. That's why it's not speaking to them, right? You would agree with that?
Depending on the context.
I know that. That's what we're talking about, context. So first century audience, Jesus is not talking to a paralytic man here. Or, for example, a person, go wash in the pool of Siloam and you're going to be healed. The blind man, you bring all kinds of blind people, tell them to read this scripture or quote this scripture. They go do that. It doesn't happen. So whose fault is that? Is that God's fault because they did not interpret the scripture correctly, or is it their fault because they didn't interpret the scripture correctly?
Well, I think you're sort of mixing apples and oranges here. If there's a story, sorry?
No, go ahead. Show me how.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a story of Jesus comes up to a man who's sick or a woman who's sick and he heals them, and he says, you get up to that person. Isn't it common sense to think he's not talking to you?
So now it's common sense to not be a futurist. Okay. Now it's common